In my view, the most important contribution to psychoanalysis from Melanie Klein, of course, is her fundamental distinction between the two different levels of mental functioning that she calls positions, because they're not stages, although one does chronologically occur before the other. But these are positions because they represent two permanent, almost like geological layers of the mind. The more primitive paranoid schizoid position and the more advanced depressive or reparative position. Narcissism characterizes paranoid schizoid functioning, and the transcendence of narcissism characterizes depressive position functioning. When we move from PS to D, we move from self-preoccupation, self-centeredness, to a capacity, in Winnicott's terms, a capacity for concern for the other. Or we move, in Freud's terms, from narcissism to object love. This is the fundamental transformation that occurs, or can occur, in the human mind and heart. This is the fundamental goal of personal development, personal evolution. I've argued that psychoanalysis is an evolutionary theory of the mind, and psychoanalytic therapy is a therapy devoted to helping people who have become stuck or fixated and have failed to evolve to resume the evolution or the development, which is the development from narcissism to object love, from paranoid schizoid narcissistic functioning to depressive or reparative position functioning. So this is the goal of psychoanalytic treatment. Psychoanalytic theory describes these two positions. In his work on religion and spirituality, Neville Symington, makes this fundamental distinction. Unfortunately, he doesn't explicitly use the Kleinian categories, PS and D, but he distinguishes two levels of spirituality, two levels of religion. One that he calls primitive, which I see as paranoid schizoid and narcissistic and magical, as opposed to depressive position, reparative position, mature spirituality, which drops the magic, the empty ritualism, and concentrates on personal transformation, helping people evolve from PS to D. And in that sense, what Symington calls mature religion is also healthy psychoanalysis, because I think we have to distinguish two levels at which psychoanalysis itself may be seen to operate. Just as much religion is empty ritual, formal church attendance, with very little concern, really, for authentic spiritual development. Similarly with spirituality, we have to distinguish between primitive spirituality, fraught with narcissism and magical thinking, as opposed to mature spirituality, which, like mature psychoanalysis, is about personal transformation from PS to D. So one has to acknowledge that a great deal of psychoanalysis, like a great deal of so-called religion and spirituality, a great deal of this operates essentially on the PS level. It's immature. It's a kind of empty ritual This is psychoanalysis failing, in my opinion, because authentic psychoanalysis should be like authentic spirituality or authentic religion. It should be about personal transformation. But sometimes it can amount to little more than submission to an ideology, submission to an idealized or idolized God figure, going through empty rituals, lying down on the couch 4 times a week, indulging in a kind of self-obsession which does not really promote authentic personal transformation. Psychoanalysis can become empty ritual, just as religious practice can be empty ritual. I guess we could say what we have there is the religion of psychoanalysis, as opposed to the authentic spirituality or the authentic transformative practice of psychoanalysis. So in human affairs, wherever we look, we can see this fundamental distinction. Even in political affairs, we distinguish a society that is operating primarily in paranoid schizoid terms, splitting, no ambivalence, rationality is sacrificed to ideology, as opposed to a healthy democratic society in which ambivalence is attained, rationality is promoted, truths, including very uncomfortable and painful truths, are faced, in which conscience is operating, not merely the superego. Superego operates within paranoid schizoid position functioning. Superego is the internal enemy. It's destructive. It seeks to destroy love and to destroy creativity while representing itself as highly moral. But this is a false morality. The superego is very threatened by genuine morality, that is, the morality of the conscience, because the morality of the conscience is authentic and truthful. It has to do with the values of life and truth and love, whereas the moralizing of the superego, not to deny that superego and conscience can sometimes overlap to some degree, as in a Venn diagram, but generally speaking, the superego, like primitive religion, is a narcissistic and rather self-destructive function, self-destructive and other-destructive. So wherever we look, we have to make this distinction. And certainly when we are evaluating the human beings that we interact with, we want to know, is this primarily a person who is operating primarily in the paranoid schizoid position? Is this primarily a narcissist? Is this fundamentally a destructive, other-destructive, self-destructive person? A self-obsessed person? A false self? Or is this a true self? Now, of course, I'm stating this in rather binary terms, and of course the truth is that there's no human being who is fully truthful and fully operating in the depressive position. It's always a matter of more or less. Even the most evolved human being still has paranoid schizoid position into which he or she regresses from time to time. So perfection is out. Perfection, of course, is a paranoid schizoid concept that we eschew. But some people have evolved. They are more evolved human beings. They are more caring. They are more loving. They are more truthful. And they are more life affirmative, as opposed to people who are more caught up in lies and hate and narcissism. So, the aim of healthy spirituality, healthy psychoanalysis, healthy religion, is to help people evolve toward the good. A healthy society helps its members evolve toward the good. So the good is associated with the loving, the truthful, the life-affirming, and with conscience. And where does this all begin? Obviously, it begins in the early mother-infant relationship, in which the radically helpless and radically dependent infant depends for its life on the primary carer, whose nurturance, whose loving attention and loving concern and emotional giving, her holding, in Winnicott's terms, her capacity for containment of the distressed states that the infant is projecting into her and that she must contain and detoxify, her empathic attunement, her capacity to respond lovingly, helpfully, all of this is crucial. Of course, her narcissism interferes with her capacity to respond, to love, and to nurture. And obviously, no one obtains perfect mothering or perfect caring at the beginning. The carers are flawed. But some carers are far more loving, far more healthy than others. And the baby is internalizing the emotional nurturance that it is receiving. And if that nurturance is good enough, to use Winnicott's phrase, good enough, it can't be perfect, but if it's good enough, the baby internalizes and builds up confidence in not merely the goodness of the carer, but the goodness of life, the goodness of the world. The baby establishes what Erik Erikson calls basic trust over basic mistrust. This lays down the foundation of the personality. It lays down a basic confidence in the reliability of other people, a confidence in the viability of oneself, a confidence or a basic trust in the goodness of life and the goodness of the world. This is faith. Good enough nurturance establishes the child's capacity to have faith in others, in life, and in itself. In my view, as a living being, the baby is innocent, is good intrinsically. Life, in my view, is intrinsically good, but the baby has to be helped to believe this. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that the mother is not creating the baby's goodness, and the mother is not creating the goodness of life and of the world. The mother is helping the baby to become able to believe this, to believe in her goodness, the world's goodness, and its own goodness. To the extent that the primary carer is impaired, narcissistic, unable properly to love, the baby's confidence in the goodness of the world and in itself is impaired. And this, of course, is the origin of emotional disturbance. And precisely because its faith in the other is disturbed, the baby turns inward. It turns away from its true self towards a false defensive self, a protective caretaker, because the baby is finding the actual caretaker unreliable. Here we have the origins of narcissism, the origins of crazy attempts on the baby's part to be self-sufficient, precisely because it finds it can't rely on the others. In the face of the unreliability of the caretaker, the baby comes to hate its own needs, to hate its own neediness, because its needs put it in a position of being disappointed, being let down, so the baby turns against its neediness, tries to become self-sufficiency. The autarkic fantasy, the fantasy of omnipotent self-sufficiency, which develops in the face of the failures of the caretaking environment. Now, of course, this needs to be qualified. A baby may have physical, medical emergency. It may need to be hospitalized. It may need to undergo an operation. At the time of its greatest need for carrying, there could be social or environmental catastrophes, war, whatever. It may not only arise from the personality disturbance of the carers, external circumstances, the baby's own physiology may interfere in various ways with all of this. But in the face of these disturbances, which are traumatic, the carer's impaired capacity to emotionally nurture constitutes a trauma for the infant. And in the face of trauma, the infant turns inwards, turns to itself, not its true self. Its true self, as Harry Guntrip explains, is put in cold storage with the hope of maybe finding the right environment for it to be revived at some future date, but the true self is split off. The baby turns to a false caretaker self, and this is the root of narcissism. Okay, the person, usually through a series of failed relationships or painful relationships, comes to understand that part of the problem is himself, part of the problem lies within. He begins to suspect that not all of the problems he's having are the fault of others. He begins to suspect he is contributing to the painful situations he finds himself in, and so he comes to psychoanalysis in the hope of finding a true analyst, an analyst who has been more or less successful in overcoming his or her own narcissistic problems and evolving towards life, love, and truth. He hopes to find in his analysis a place of truth, a place where he can be helped to face the truth, including the truth of his own falsity, his own fraudulence, and perhaps begin to see through and perhaps let go of his false self, begin to be able to develop a capacity to tolerate and bear painful truths, a place where he can perhaps begin to be able to become a truer self, himself, not by identifying with the analyst. It's important for the analyst to be a fairly evolved person, but the cure doesn't involve identifying. One of the great mistakes of the Christian tradition has been the idea of the imitatio Christi. What Christians are supposed to do is imitate Jesus. What would Jesus do? No, that's not the solution, to merely identify with another and try to live up to the rules and the idealized traits in the other. That's a narcissistic project. It's within my own fairly delusional self-sufficiency that I'm going to imitate Christ. Well, the same thing applies in analysis. It's an illusion to think that the patient is going to improve by imitating his idealized psychoanalyst or internalize. Kohut wrote of transmuting internalization, and Melanie Klein also talked about internalizing and building up a good internal object. These ideas need to be rethought critically. So it's not a matter of imitating a true person or imitating a loving person. It's a matter of becoming a true person, becoming a loving person, not by imitating someone as an ideal. So for Christians, it's not a matter of imitating Christ. It's a matter of allowing Christ to come into one's life and allowing Christ inside and allowing him to do the work of transformation. This is a symbolic language, which really means allowing truth and love and life to come in to oneself. Not a matter of identifying with people who one sees as truthful and loving, but allowing love and truth and life to operate inside oneself. It's not a matter of identifying, it's a matter of surrendering to the truth and to what is life-affirming and what is loving, which of course involves facing one's hating. Part of becoming real is a matter of facing one's hatred as much as facing one's love. This is how self-transformation occurs, and it is an often painful and at times quite frightening process. It's very frightening to find the degree to which one is fraudulent. It's quite painful to discover the degree to which one has been living a lie. It's quite painful to discover how out of sync with conscience one's life has been. There is shame to be faced. There is guilt to be faced. and processed and worked through. So this process of self-transformation, moving from the illusions and the delusions of the paranoid schizoid position, moving from the narcissistic self-obsession of the paranoid schizoid position towards genuine loving care and concern for others and for one's true self. This is a difficult and painful process. The true self is associated with genuine creativity, not fake creativity, not the creativity based on copying the work of the masters and the style of the masters. One may have to do that for a time, but genuine creativity is a matter of finding one's own voice, finding one's own true self, one's own true inspiration, one's own true capacity to think and to love and to live and to express this. We're talking really, I guess, about the distinction between a change of one's mind as distinct from a change of heart. Transformations in O. Change on an existential level. A genuine and deep change of heart, not merely of one's ways of thinking and understanding oneself. And when we think of a change of heart, one really is talking about something like a conversion. I do believe that a really good psychoanalytic experience involves a conversion. It's the conversion that Melanie Klein described as the move from being centered in the paranoid schizoid, narcissistic position to being centered in the depressive reparative position, where one really has the capacity to care for the other and an enhanced capacity to love the other, a transcendence to a considerable degree of narcissism, and an enhanced capacity to test reality and to face reality and to bear reality. This really deserves the term conversion. Most psychoanalysts would be very reluctant to describe what they're trying to do as converting patients, but I just think that's false to deny it. I think we are in the conversion business, as I've said previously. A part of this conversion is the change from being a moralistic person to being a conscientious person. It's one thing to bandy around talk of rules and to moralize about this and that. It's another thing to strive to bring one's living into sync with one's conscience. That's hard. That involves painful choices, that often involves degrees of self-sacrifice. It involves no longer allowing hedonism and pleasure-seeking or attending to one's personal survival. That at times has to take a back seat to conscientious action, which may involve pain and self-sacrifice, even to the point at times of laying down one's life out of devotion to conscience. So we're talking about a level of change that really does, I think, merit description as a kind of conversion. Not that psychoanalysts are seeking to manufacture saints, but would many psychoanalysts deeply object? Well, I'm afraid they would. I think they would object to the idea that we're in the business of trying to help people become better human beings. Most analysts would not object to the idea that we're trying to help people become more truthful, because most analysts are rationalists, Enlightenment rationalists. They think that reality testing, facing truth, that's acceptable language, but we're trying to help people become more loving. A lot of analysts get a little nervous and uncomfortable with that kind of language. Certainly Freud did. That's a little too close to religion for most psychoanalysts. But really, if they were more honest, I think they would admit that we hope that our patients will not only become more truthful, but also more loving, and also more life-affirming, and less narcissistic. These are the goals of the analytic process, and this is the business of self-transformation, not merely on the level of the mind, but also on the level of the heart.